Hi, I'm LAURICE Alexander. This is Bridge City News, and here are some of the top stories we've been following. Premier Jason Kenney's UCP government has taken tax hikes off the table. Plus, a family is devastated by a hit-and-run that killed a Blood Tribe man, seriously injured his girlfriend and their newborn child. And a Lethbridge artist is nominated for a National Photography Award.
Your nation, your province, your southern Alberta. From the heart of Lethbridge, it's Bridge City News Weekend Edition.
Thanks for joining us. On Thursday, it's Budget Day in Alberta, a time that will remind residents that last year's projected eye-popping $6.8 billion deficit was actually the good old days. Since then, that deficit has tripled to $21 billion, while taxpayer-supported debt has ballooned to $97 billion. Victims of oil price wars and the COVID-19 pandemic that have decimated Alberta's bottom line. Finance Minister Travis Taves says the deficits will continue and the budget will focus on COVID-19 pandemic aid, along with getting the economy back on its feet. The one certainty will be no new taxes in a province that currently has the lowest overall tax regime in Canada. Premier Jason Kenney took any tax hikes off the table last week, particularly any notion of a sales tax, saying now is not the time to be dipping into pockets. Alberta Health Services has released its update on COVID-19 on Saturday, covering statistics compiled over the previous 24 hours. 380 new cases were confirmed across the province, bringing the total to 130,735. Of those, 4,803 cases are active, while 124,114 people have recovered. In the South Zone, 24 people tested positive, including 12 in Lethbridge. Since yesterday's update, another 6 Albertans died from COVID, 1 each in the Edmonton and Central Zones and 4 in Calgary. To date, the virus has claimed the lives of 1,818 people in the province. The father of a man killed in a hit-and-run by a potentially speeding, inebriated driver says the family is facing a long, tough road to heal from the tragedy. Blade Crow, 21 years old, was standing on a raised traffic island with his girlfriend, Aaliyah, around 8:20 p.m. Thursday, waiting to cross the street near Chinook Center Mall in Calgary. The couple was pushing Aaliyah's baby, Ember, in a stroller. The driver of an SUV failed to make the right-hand turn and instead drove up onto the island, hitting the family from behind and driving across 2 more raised islands before finally coming to a stop after hitting a snowbank. Crow was killed and Aaliyah and Ember taken to hospital in life-threatening condition. Loved ones plan to hold a candlelight vigil at the crash site at 7 p.m. tonight. Friends have also set up an online fundraiser to support the family and cover funeral costs. Lethbridge's Angeline Simon is one of 24 artists in Canada with the chance of winning $10,000 and a place in 2 group exhibitions. Simon is up for the New Generation Photography Award through the National Gallery of Canada. Simon graduated from the University of Lethbridge in 2018 with a Bachelor of Fine Arts in Art Studio, which helped her solidify her passion for photography. If selected, Simon said she would put the $10,000 toward improving her practice. Winners will be selected on March 23rd. Pastor Arthur Pawlowski, who leads the street ministry in Calgary, is a die-hard disciple. He spoke with BCN about preaching the gospel and feeding the poor at any cost, even his life.
I've never closed the church. I'll never close the church. If they arrest me, I'll do a church in prison. I was arrested many times and I turned the cell into a preaching pulpit. And I have captive audience every single time. They cannot escape. They're stuck there with me.
Pawlowski has indeed turned adversity into opportunity. No stranger to media attention, Pawlowski believes that our fight with COVID-19 is not a wrestle with flesh and blood.
as a church, we failed Jesus Christ. We have to go to our knees and we have to say to him, God, forgive us for not doing what you called us to do. Forgive us for being terrified. Forgive us for not having faith in you. Forgive us that the virus was bigger in our minds, in our hearts, than your word that says nothing will touch you.
Halewski is challenging pastors to speak out about their faith being threatened.
They're terrified. They don't want to lose their charitable status. They don't want to lose their support. They don't want to be blacklisted by the media and slandered like me. They don't want to be called white supremacists. They don't want to be called racist. They don't want to be called homophobes. They don't want to be called xenophobes. I mean, ridiculous. So they prefer to be in the shadows.
With no plans on stopping, this street preacher says fulfilling the plans God has for his life takes precedence over, well, pretty much everything.
I'm going to do what I have been doing for the past 22 years. I'll feed the poor, no matter what they will bring. I'll congregate here. I will still pray for the sick. I'll still anoint them with oil. And I will still deliver the message that God is giving me, the message that he's putting in my heart.
It is 36 days until Easter, which means Lent has officially begun. It's an important time for people in the Christian community, but in response to COVID-19 safety measures, many will be practicing traditions in a different way.
The core of Lent, I think, transcends all time. So the core of what we're doing doesn't change year to year, decade to decade, millennia to millennia. However, my guess is that there are many more people who are sensing loneliness and fear and frustration and suffering. And in that way, I'm almost wondering if we're better primed to understand what Jesus did for us. He left the perfect relationship with God and came and took on human flesh and walked among us. He understands our walk better than we ever can imagine. And I think this Lent, I hope we can draw near to God in a unique and powerful way.
Lent comes to an end at Easter on April 4th. Have you ever wondered about some of the items you see that are made in and around Lethbridge? The Galt Museum and Archives have introduced their newest exhibit called Made in Stories of Stuff. As Micah Quinn reports, this exhibit will highlight some items that were handcrafted, manufactured, or have a story related to our city.
The Galt has been closed to the public due to COVID-19 restrictions, but the museum has gone full circle by switching to an online format for their exhibits.
And it's been really interesting because through the video format, we've actually kind of increased our range. So we're getting feedback from people, as far away as Vancouver Island or the shores of the Hudson's Bay.
Every object has a story, but the best were selected for the Made in Stories of Stuff exhibit.
So first of all, we worked with a group of Nitsitapi knowledge keepers and elders who were able to make some selections of objects in our collection and share their knowledge about where those objects were made, what they were made from. And then we focused on some pieces that were made in Lethbridge, since settlement. So some agricultural pieces, food processing, and other things that people may not know have been made in and around Lethbridge.
This Italian accordion was donated to the Galt a few years ago, and it has a special connection to Lethbridge.
And it was owned by a fellow who immigrated to Lethbridge in 1924, but he had it made for him in Italy, which was his homeland. And he was part of the Italian-Canadian club here in Lethbridge, so he would frequently play for things like the club's picnics or family gatherings, different community events. And so it's a piece that I think really connects strongly with his home in Italy, but something that allowed him to bridge his new home here in Lethbridge and maintain some of those family connections.
The exhibit will be up until May 9th of this year at the Galt Museum and Archives. For Bridge City News, I'm Micah Quinn.
During one of the worst winter storms on record, churches across Texas have opened their doors to people needing shelter. Houston's Lakewood Church, pastored by Joel Osteen, has provided a warm place to stay and a hot meal to over 1,000 people since the storm began.
We were blessed this week to open our church as a shelter to take care of our fellow Houstonians. We helped a lot of people stay warm, eat good meals, and assisted them through this difficult storm.
My power went out, water went out, so I was at home scared to death, didn't know what to do. Called several people and places, nothing was open, no gas stations, and called 311, and 311 provided a cab and and brought me over to Lakewood Church. And so I've been here since yesterday. It's awesome that they're helping, that they're providing, and they're opening up the doors to everyone, to anyone and everyone.
Well, we've had a lot of people come in. Obviously no power, maybe no water, and we've been really blessed.
Recapping one of our top news stories. Thursday is Budget Day in Alberta, a time that will remind residents that last year's projected eye-popping $6.8 billion deficit was actually the good old days. The deficit has since tripled to $21 billion, while taxpayer-supported debt has ballooned to $97 billion. Victims of oil price wars and the COVID-19 pandemic that have decimated Alberta's bottom line. And a look at weekend weather. Windy conditions continue into the week. Partly cloudy skies tonight, clearing near midnight with a low of +5 degrees. On Monday, expect sunny skies and a +9 degrees, along with a west wind gusting from 60 to 80 kilometers per hour.
Today's weather is brought to you by ColumbianDirect.com. Café Coffee, specialty coffee from our family to yours.
After the break, BCN's Hal Roberts discusses current issues impacting our country with R.E. GOLDKIND, a criminal defense lawyer in Toronto. Stay with us.
Joining me today to talk about some of the interesting issues and everything from the power of big tech, social media companies, to how Ottawa is dealing with COVID-19 restrictions is criminal defense lawyer and political commentator R.E. GOLDKIND, joining me once again from Toronto. Welcome back to Bridge City News, R.E.
Hal, always great to be on with you.
News this week that the common-law wife of the Nova Scotia gunman who killed 22 people last spring has been named in a lawsuit launched by some of the victims' families. Now, we all obviously ache for the families, what they're going through, but I thought Lisa Banfield was also someone who was abused by the gunman. Can you really explain and share why she's being sued?
Sure, and it appears offensive when you first see the headline. Why is somebody who's a victim of Wortman, the perpetrator, being sued by a bunch of lawyers looking for a deep payout for the victims who were justifiably victimized? Why go after another victim? There's something very oxymoronic about that. But the way the system works, and this is something to take people right inside baseball, when you're a plaintiff's lawyer, or even if you're a defendant or an insurance lawyer, you try and spread the wings of the lawsuit as far as you can. You look for every possible avenue to sue, every person who may be covered by insurance. You're looking for somebody that may have some peripheral responsibility that you may be able to collect from. It will take years to suss this out, but there is really nothing unusual about it, although it is, in my view, quite odious.
Are there maybe some good reasons for her to bear some of the guilt?
One of the arguments that the plaintiff lawyers make specifically in the Wortman case is that because of the artillery, the amount of ammunition, the kind of weaponry he had, the way he conducted his life, that she must have had some insight that he was literally a ticking time bomb. Now, if that part is proven, that's much more interesting to me as a lawyer or a citizen. If she knew he was planning something, not necessarily what it was or who it was against, but if it was something that she felt in her heart of hearts was more than, oh, he likes target shooting in our backyard. If she had that kind of inkling and that can be proven, she then opens herself up to a liability that I then think I don't have any problem with.
Let's talk a bit on the issue of Canadians flying back to Canada after traveling internationally, some of the warm tropical destinations, which many of us can probably get away to right now, but they're being forced to quarantine in some of these high-priced hotels. Is this even constitutional? What are some of the legal challenges here?
So this is one that has really annoyed me, particularly given my distaste for many aspects of our government, which seems to criminalize the behavior of people who don't commit crimes, snowbirds, people wanting a vacation. There's been no crime against that. There's no suggestion that an elderly couple that have saved for 50 years to afford a little condo in Florida deserve the attention of our government as if they're reprobates or people coming up into our border illegally that I assure you will never have to get tested or pay $2,500 of their own money to go into a hotel. And from a constitutional black letter point, One of the reasons that I think the federal government has not implemented this yet, they talked about it 2 weeks ago, they put out press releases, it was to get March breakers to not go down south, because then you'd think you have to come back and pay $2,500 for a Howard Johnson. No offense to Howard Johnson. But to tell a citizen who has the freedom pursuant to our charter, and I'm no charter bleeding heart, but a citizen has a right to leave Canada, remain in Canada, and come back to Canada. So if you have your own house, you have a house, a condo, an apartment, and you can show that you're quarantining there, to me, this is a really serious infringement on people's rights that they have to not only stay in a hotel that they don't want to stay in, because the key is the quarantine. Don't go out, don't spread the virus. I have no problem with that. But we're going to charge people $2,500 for 3 nights in a hotel, and the government's answer is because security and food costs make that amount that. That's something that, to me, again, to use a word I used before, is odious.
Now, some people are saying, Ari, why not simply have air travelers take a rapid COVID-19 test and be done with it, just kind of move on from there?
Well, one of the things they're talking about, even as we speak, is making any traveler coming into any international airport take a test to come in. Before you even board your plane in many countries, you have to do that. They're going to put it at the US-Canadian land border. But there's something so hypocritical about this. I live in Toronto. Our international airport since March of 2020 has had dozens of international flights pouring into this country every day with no testing, all of this nonsense that the variants seem to have marched into Canada on tippy toes. No. And now all of a sudden, ordinary average Canadians, not law breaking, not people who thumb their nose at COVID, not a bunch of yahoos at a nightclub, they're essentially being criminalized when, quite simply, take the test at the airport, go home, have officers or peace officers check the homes for all I care, but to make people stay in hotels who may not even have that money, there's just something to me that reeks of that.
Now, Ari, many Canadians believe that certain branches of government are going way too far and breaching our civil rights in order to protect us from the spread of COVID-19 and even the new variants. What are your thoughts on something like the Quebec curfew? It seems pretty harsh.
Well, what a lot of Canadians haven't grasped or put their head around is just how powerful the emergency public health measures are in each province, or the Quarantine Act federally. You know, people are so used to you and I talking about the criminal law and, you know, you can't burst into somebody's house without a search warrant, or you can't arrest somebody because you don't like what their shoes are. If you look at these public health measures, and for good reason, I'm not criticizing them, they give peace officers, bylaw officers, public health officers, and police officers tremendous powers. The problem in their execution is that the governments at all stages, municipal, such as mayors, provincial premiers, and our fearless leader, Prime Minister Hypocrite, they never explain to the Canadian public why these measures are going to significantly affect COVID. If the science was revealed, if Trudeau and the premiers of provinces, the premier of Quebec explaining the curfew, I understand that more, but it's not like the virus goes to sleep between 10 p.m. and 6 a.m. That's where it gets into reasonable sorts of questions of what the powers should be. The problem is these powers that I just mentioned are so broad, the penalties are so significant, that if you can't afford a lawyer like me to march you into court and plead your case, a case that absent an emergency injunction probably isn't going to get heard till 2023, the Canadian public really doesn't have much choice. So while I'm pro restrictions, while I understand masking, while I understand keeping long-term care homes safe, which is really where this should be focused, the elderly, we have based everything with COVID on a death toll. We have forgotten everything else that affects people's lives. The curfew I had an issue with, the stay-at-home order in the province of Ontario, I had an issue with, but Premier Ford did it differently. He didn't sort of say, I'm going to arrest my way out of COVID. He just said to people, if in doubt, don't go out.
Now let's talk about social media and big tech for just a moment here, Ari. The power these companies yield is quite sobering. What can be done to protect democracy and free speech rights for both the left and the right opinions on social media?
Well, I think even in the premise of that question, there's a misnomer. there is no issue with the left speaking freely. The left can say whatever it wants about whoever it wants, whenever it wants, as viciously as it wants. And I don't mean center left and center right. I mean the far left. We're told that you can't talk about certain issues in this country if you talk about immigration, if you talk about crime, because of even what happened on January 6th south of the border. You can't even be a conservative anymore. What is Aaron O'Toole now? He's essentially Justin Trudeau without the looks. That's a problem when we talk about the freedom of speech issue, because right now, and I'm not even saying I'm on the left or right, my politics don't matter, but the threat from big tech, which people should understand, big tech is run by people who are far left. That is Silicon Valley. They are literally now much more powerful than governments. So when I hear some people say, well, it's private companies regulating Trump, it's private companies, they can do what they want. When a private company gets to a position that they can more powerfully dictate the discourse, dictate policy, dictate what is safe to talk about or not talk about, or I'll use this term, to dictate what trends, that's much more powerful than a government. And my view, and I feel upset about my view, is that nothing is going to be able to stop big tech. They are destroying democracy. They are destroying elections. They give what are called in-kind donations. 99% of people don't know what that term means. They think I'm talking about an in-law. You have to disclose in an election. If I give you, Hal, you're running for office, $500, I have to disclose that, and there are maximums. But if I'm big tech and Twitter, and I want Hal to lose, I can change, as Google and Facebook do, my algorithms so that Hal and his platform disappear. That's how strong a rebuke we have to freedom of speech now, and it is not two-sided. It is saying there is only one position, and anything else ends with the term ism or ist, and that is dangerous.
You know what's really interesting, as well as some of the interviews we've done, COVID, we've talked to some doctors, some other specialists, epidemiologists who maybe didn't agree with the majority. We posted those videos on YouTube. They were deleted, and we were banned from YouTube for about a week or two. So we had to put the videos elsewhere on other platforms, BitChute.
And remember,
and
Google owns YouTube. People forget that Google owns YouTube. YouTube is not its own company. It's owned by the most powerful company, Google. And remember, science, which you're told there is only one way. And again, I am a big believer in science. I'm not getting into my view. But the whole idea of science is that it's not perfect. It's constantly being challenged by dissenting opinions until we get to a consensus. How will people ever trust science if you're told that there can be no testing of said science?
Yeah, and cancel culture is rampant right now in our society. Really have to watch for that. Ari, what can be done legally to protect privacy rights of Canadians from the social media giants? Much of the public doesn't even realize that some companies have access to their personal photos, their text messages, and can sell their information to other people.
Not only can they do it, that is literally how they monetize many of these apps. Many people think they're going on to TikTok to do stupid videos that go far too viral. Many people, when they are accessing an app, you'll get that quick message that says your phone, if you agree, will access X, Y, Z, A, B, and C. People don't give a second thought to privacy anymore. So I'd love to give some grand answer as to how it could be stopped and how we can get big tech to not use your information for nefarious purposes. That horse has left the barn. That genie has left the bottle. There is literally no answer I can give you unless I wanted to do mental gymnastics that can put a stop to Facebook, Google, the TikTok, which is, again, remember, held by a foreign company. We know and in a foreign country that we know is not our friend. These are all issues of privacy that Canadians essentially, because of our own addictions to our own devices in our hands, we've thrown out the idea of privacy. Now, certain companies are crossing lines, but certainly the tech companies know exactly how addicted we are to giving up our privacy.
And never give up our phones, right? That's one thing, yeah, we're very addicted to. Because it's not just a phone anymore, it's a computer. I mean, it does so much more, right? I mean, it's incredible what you can do with your phone these days.
And not only that, Hal, remember, if you listen to anybody who's left Google, they will tell you that the way they deal with these apps and create them is specifically to affect your brain to make them more addictive. This is not happening by accident. And think through the last year in COVID, tying into your questions about COVID, think through the effect on children and teenagers' minds for the last year when all they've been doing for 1 year is staring at stupid screens, looking at stupid apps, and playing stupid video games. The idea of reading a book makes me sound like the 47-year-old that I proudly am.
Ari, so what can the Canadian government really do to protect us from a lot of these social media giants?
So not only is the Canadian government not protecting us from these giants, the Canadian government is in bed with these tech giants. Now, what does that mean? Look at any list of donors to the various political parties, particularly the Liberal Party. These are the most well-influenced lobbyists. These are the largest donors, particularly if you're looking in the United States. Not only is the Canadian government feckless, and that's the right word, against big tech. And by the way, it's a big issue given my answer earlier about how big tech dominates the conversation. Your listeners, your viewers, Hal, who are ordinary average Canadians with ordinary average values, they've been thrown out. Now we're told the entire world is homophobic, sexist, racist, Islamophobic, can't criticize this, can't talk about even a Canadian identity. Everything is poison. And what is our government doing? And this ties into journalism. Just this week, over a number of hundreds of people I know, the best journalists in Canada, the best radio people, the best TV people, have all been fired because there's no ad revenue in traditional journalism anymore. Where's all the ad revenue? Facebook and Google. And our government's answer, our heritage minister, who's a joke, I'm sure he's a nice man, but his policies are a joke, is that the government is going to ensure that big tech has even more control in our country's debate and discussion, not less. That should scare the ordinary, average, hardworking taxpayer who's watching Canada, in my view, descend into a Canada that isn't even for Canadians anymore. And by Canadians, I mean ordinary average people of all races, all faiths, all religion, who simply want to get up, go to a job that exists, raise children in a community that's safe. But right now we have a situation where the inmates are running the asylum.
So much to digest there. Wow. Thank you so much, Ari. Appreciate your legal insight. And yeah, interesting times ahead for all of us here. Criminal defense lawyer and political insider and commentator Ari Goldkind, thanks again for joining me from Toronto.
Always great to be with you, Hal. Thank you.
Canada's debt level has ballooned astronomically over the last few years, but is it sustainable? And even if it is continued debt a good idea for our nation? Today's guest is Dr. Trevor Tombe, Associate Professor of Economics at the University of Calgary. He joins me via Skype from Calgary. Dr. Tombe, thank you so much for joining me today.
Great to be here. Thanks for having me on.
So, Dr. Tombe, our federal government has been piling up like never before with COVID spending. However, with the current low interest rates, apparently it's actually sustainable. Can you explain this?
Sure. So when we think about debt sustainability for a government, what we're really talking about is whether the government is able to service and carry that debt. Will it be able to make its interest payments in the future? So the rate of interest that investors lending government money are charging, that matters. But it's not the only thing that matters. We also need to worry about the government's ability to raise revenue. So economic growth rates matter as well. So in the future, going forward, it does look like the federal debt today, even though it's risen very high, is sustainable because of a combination of low rates, hopefully future economic growth, which raises federal revenues.
Okay, so if I understand correctly, then as long as economic growth exceeds interest rates, we're okay. Right?
Well, that's one of the most important things to look at for public debt sustainability. If economic growth rates do exceed interest rates, then it is much easier for governments to carry debt levels because the debt to GDP would mechanically be falling, even if there are modest deficits run by a government.
Okay, so but if interest rates rise above economic growth, then we would have to either raise taxes or cut spending or potentially both?
That's right. If interest rates are higher than economic growth, then there's this built-in pressure for debt to grow faster than the overall economy, which itself would not be sustainable. So we would need the government to run surpluses in order to shrink debt, pay it down to keep it from growing faster than the economy.
Yeah, so I guess the question is increased borrowing and spending worth the gamble?
Part of the reason for the higher debt now is, of course, the spending related to COVID. That's not the only part of it, though. The rate of economic growth has really contracted quite a bit in 2020. Lots of employment losses, corporate profits are shrinking. So naturally, government revenue is going to fall. So, in some sense, a good chunk of the debt that we're seeing federally and provincially is difficult to avoid and wasn't really due to a choice, but was a consequence of the deep recession that occurred because of COVID in 2020. So going forward, I think is a more important question. How much spending does the federal government roll out after we're on the other side of the public health crisis? How quickly does employment rebound and therefore government revenues rise? I think that's the more interesting policy question.
Yeah, interesting. So, what would you say to those who advocate for less borrowing and more spending cutbacks?
Well, it's an important debate to be had for sure. And there are two sides of a budget. So if we want to think about getting the federal finances back in order in the coming years, gradually, we can think about the revenue side of the budget, tax changes, or we can think about the spending side, either growing spending more slowly or cutting back in certain areas. I think the level of spending that we're seeing right now is largely in the form of temporary income support programs. So that should absolutely be cut back as we get to the other side of the public health crisis. And I think the question is not whether we will, but how quickly and how much those cutbacks will occur.
Now, Dr. Toom, you write that the bigger debt problem we face in Canada is the increasing debt load of our provincial governments. So how is this different from the national debt issue?
Great question. And we certainly look at the federal debt in 2020 rising so much as it did. We look at that with a great deal of concern. But the federal government going forward, most of its revenue comes from income taxes and the GST. And so it is going to keep pace with economic growth. And it's not the order of government in Canada that pays for things like healthcare, education, and so on. Most of that is by provinces. So our aging population, which has really started to ramp up recently and will continue to be a source of pressure in the healthcare system, those costs are going to be borne by provincial governments. And most provinces don't raise nearly as much revenue from income and sales taxes as the federal government does. So the provinces have this structural problem of revenue growing more slowly than healthcare costs are going to in the coming years. So I have a great deal of concern around provincial debt, much more than the federal debt, just because of demographics and provinces bearing the brunt of an aging population.
Yeah, would you say that those are some of the main drivers that are increasing provincial debt load specifically for Alberta?
Yeah, so Alberta, like other provinces going forward, basically the entire reason why provincial debt levels may not be sustainable under current policy is because of an aging population. This increases health costs, and that's entirely borne by provinces. But it also shrinks the rate of economic growth. As people retire, they're not working anymore. And so there's fewer people participating in the labor force. And so that creates pressure too. But yeah, aging and the effect of that on provinces, that's a huge deal that we haven't yet come to grips with.
So what options do the provinces have then to rein in the debt and still keep the necessary bills paid?
So lots of options, and these are going to vary across provinces. Two sides of the budget, as I mentioned earlier, we can think about tax changes on the revenue side. And quite frankly, I kind of think that's where Alberta might go in the short term. But then also think about changing the rate of growth of healthcare spending. Think about innovation and reforms to how healthcare is done, how it's operated, um, whether we have increased contracting out for different services, for example. I think you'll see provinces experimenting with different approaches there to try and ensure that health costs don't grow as much as we currently fear they will.
How much does personal and household debt play into all of this?
So that's another great question. It's not as though the government is the only entity seeing debt levels rise. I mean, this is a deep and hopefully won't be too long lasting, but will last for some time. This economic shock is increasing debt of businesses. Household debt hasn't risen as much because of the government income transfer programs being so large and have actually been larger than the income losses that most households have experienced through 2020. But going forward, that is important to keep an eye on. Canadian household debt levels are larger relative to income compared to, say, the United States. But at the same time, we also have a lot of assets. Real estate being a big part of that, but not the only part of it. So I'm actually fairly optimistic that our household debt is itself sustainable, even though some do point to it as a source of concern.
But hasn't Canada had some significant increases in this area?
Yep. So we certainly have seen an increase in household debt, no question. But at the same time, we have also seen an increase in household wealth. So debt increasing, yep, that's happening. But so too are assets increasing, and not just real estate. Even if you exclude real estate, the financial wealth of households in Canada has also increased, and the debt relative to our assets, that's actually been relatively stable. So it hasn't increased in the same way that we see debt to income.
Mm-hmm. Now, we obviously do need spending to keep our economy going strong, right? But what advice do you have when it comes to household spending for those families with a tight budget?
That's an important question that I think many will be increasingly thinking about as we recover from this shock, especially if returning to employment or returning to the number of hours that you used to work. It goes fairly slowly, so it depends on the pace of the recovery. But for a household on a tight budget, it's important to think about trade-offs when allocating those household budgets. So to the extent that you can delay larger purchases of durable goods, that's often something that makes sense. So new vehicles or replacing appliances, things like that. But my most important piece of advice in the short term is to pop on to the provincial and federal government websites and check to see if you qualify for one of the many support programs that exist. So if you're eligible for something, take advantage of it.
Interesting. Okay, what kind of support programs are you talking about? And wouldn't this increase some of the Canadian debt in the long run?
Absolutely. Absolutely. So the federal support programs, the biggest one was the emergency response benefit. That's transitioning now into kind of an expanded EI program and a related program called the Canada Recovery Benefit. Absolutely. When a person applies and qualifies and receives transfers under those programs, that does increase public debt. I would, though, from the perspective of an individual family, if you're entitled to something and the choice is whether you as an individual carries more debt or whether you can have the government provide you an income support program, then from your individual perspective, that's a no-brainer. And it's important not to leave opportunities on the table if you indeed qualify for those programs. They're intended to support families that need it. And so if you need it, apply for it.
Okay. Can we chat a bit about the global economic situation? So the IFF, or the Institute of International Finance, says global in debt is now around the $277 trillion mark. So that's a big number, right? Is this sustainable?
So that is absolutely a big number. It includes all sources of debt, not just public debt. It does also need to be compared to the other side of the balance sheet. So debt is one thing, but assets are another. And Credit Suisse estimates that global assets are a little bit over $600 trillion. So global wealth is positive. We have more assets than we have in debt. And so it's important to keep both sides of the equation in mind. And whether debt is sustainable depends on who's carrying it. Some government debt is sustainable. Some governments are facing a more difficult situation. We saw that following the financial crisis, where Greece found itself in a very difficult situation. I think we may see certain countries find themselves in a really difficult spot. Canada's lucky in that we're not facing that in the short term, but we shouldn't just look at 277 trillion in debt and panic. It does need to be compared to the wealth that we have and the assets that we own and the income that we generate.
Okay, but isn't the world economy operating at a deficit? You're saying it's not?
So the world economy as a whole, we shouldn't think of it operating at a deficit. Governments operate sometimes in a deficit situation, and they borrow from the private sector who is saving. Right? So one person's borrowing is another person's saving. And the only question is whether that arrangement is sustainable. Will the borrower be able to make the interest payments on the debt? And if so, then that's sustainable.
So do you think a global crash would ever happen?
So I don't think that well, keep in mind, we have gone through, as a globe, a very large negative shock and a huge contraction in 2020. We're almost surely going to be recovering from that over the next couple of years. And certain countries may see more difficult challenges for sure than others, just like we saw following the financial crisis. But global economic growth will return as vaccination rates get to levels that will get the pandemic under control.
Interesting. Dr. Toom, I love your optimism for the it's
hopefully
refreshing.
It's not misplaced.
It's refreshing these days, particularly. Thanks so much for your expertise today, Dr. Toom. We really appreciate having you on.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Education about the dangers of impaired driving continues to increase, but yet the problem has not been solved yet. Joining me now to discuss this in greater detail is ANITA HUCHALA. She's the president of the Lethbridge and area chapter of MAD, or Mothers Against Drunk Driving. ANITA, welcome to Bridge City News.
Good evening, and thank you for having me.
Now, ANITA, before we get into the nuts and bolts of what MAD is all about, tell me about those amazing images behind you. Are those victims of drunk drivers?
They are victims and survivors. This is what we call our memory wall. And we take this to many of our events and show it on display. So it kind of is a hard message that hits home with many people to see the number of faces that we do have on our wall.
Now, can you explain the focus of your organization, Mothers Against Drunk Driving? What kinds of services do you offer specifically here in Southern Alberta?
Well, first and foremost, our mission is to stop impaired driving and support the victims of this violent crime. The services that our chapter can offer here in Southern Alberta are victim and survivor support, and that's first and foremost, like I said. So we can offer court accompaniment. We help them with their victim impact statement. We also answer many questions because going through the court process is very difficult, trying, and time consuming. We also offer youth services here. So we have different presentations that are geared towards elementary and the junior high, as well as the high schools, to also educate them on the dangers of consuming alcohol and or drugs, and then the dangers of getting behind the wheel during that. And then we also have several other things that we do. We have public awareness and education programs that are out there that we're always educating the public as to be aware of the dangers of drinking and driving.
ANITA, how do you really console or comfort somebody whose family is the victim of a drunk driver, somebody who was killed, let's say a mother, a son, a daughter, an innocent child? We've seen that time and time again by a drunk driver. How do you console and comfort that family? What do you even say to them? Where do you begin?
There's really nothing right or wrong to say. Every situation is different. The best you can do is be there for that family. One of the first things that I do when I'm meeting a family for the first time is ask them to tell me about their loved one that they have lost. I want to hear about who they were. What did they mean to the community? What did they mean to the family? What kind of work did they do? And that way it puts it a little bit more of a personal curve on it. And it also helps offer us some information so we know how better to serve this family.
Let's also talk about the driver involved in this collision. Chances are that person is devastated on the inside. You know, they may face criminal charges on top of that, but they have to live with the fact that they killed another person with their vehicle.
Right, right. That's also very difficult. We usually don't step forward to help them or anything like that because we are there for the victims of this. But there's several agencies here in the Southern Alberta area that can help counsel them to get through their grief as well, because it is very difficult. And it's not only difficult for the impaired driver, but it's also difficult for their families to have to realize that somebody in their family has chosen to get behind the wheel and has caused a crash.
So, Anita, where are we at in Canada? Have impaired driving incidents actually decreased? Are we improving at all?
I'd like to think personally that yes, we are improving. We're getting the message out there. We're getting more instruments for our police services to be using to help detect impaired drivers quicker and get them off the road. With the implementation of Bill 21 recently that just rolled out on December 1st, it does form some harsher penalties that the officers can be enforcing on impaired drivers.
Anita, do you have any stats whatsoever about how many people are killed or injured annually from impaired drivers?
From a math standpoint, with several years of research and statistics that we have, our odds are looking at on an average that 4 people are killed and 175 are injured every single day across Canada. And those numbers are absolutely staggering.
Now, we've talked about people who are drinking and driving. What about those who are maybe addicted to opioids or high on other drugs, methamphetamine, fentanyl, or anything else, who's also impaired when they get behind the wheel?
Correct. I think one of the firmest statements I can say is impaired. Whether you're taking the alcohol, whether you're taking the drugs, or even prescription drugs, we are seeing a rise at times in different age brackets of people who are prescribed opioids, whether it be from a surgery or a lengthy illness that they're dealing with and stuff, and they take that and then choose to get behind the wheel without realizing how impaired they may be. So I feel that it's always the best thing is to plan ahead. Plan ahead. Think about what your actions are and always plan ahead.
Anita, let's talk about the statistics involving female or women drivers getting behind the wheel while they're impaired.
We are seeing at times a number go up of women that are receiving opioid medication for a number of various conditions. And without even thinking, they're also getting behind the wheel, maybe to slip down to the mall to do a bit of shopping or slip out and get the groceries. And again, they're not realizing how they may be impaired with their driving. And it's an increase that we see not only just women, men are doing it as well. But because of this situation, our numbers are constantly changing with that. So we have to take into consideration the different medications that we can be taking that could be affecting us.
You know, I have seniors in my family who are suffering from painful conditions like fibromyalgia, osteoarthritis, and they take the opioids. At the same time, they get behind the wheel, so they can be impaired too, is what you're saying.
Right, right, without possibly knowing it. It's a simple thing as when we have a cold or allergies. You know, there is drugs in there that can help, or not help, they help the situation, but they also form impairment on us. And we may not be at our highest alertness that we need to be.
Now, you're right. A lot of that cold and cough and flu medicine, a lot of times is quite high in alcohol content. So you take that and you get behind the wheel, you're right, you're impaired. Anita, if I have a friend, a neighbor, or relative who drives impaired, what's the very first thing that I should do?
The very first thing is call 911. That is the first thing that you should do. Never ever confront the person, never try to stop them from getting behind the wheel. Call 911, take as much information as you can, and then assess the situation. You never ever want to put yourself in danger.
Now, we talked about driving while under the influence of alcohol or maybe opioids. What about the challenges of driving after using cannabis? Do you think Canadians are aware of the dangers of this?
I think there's been a great amount of education out there for us to learn from. They do recommend that you wait anywhere between 4 to 6 hours after consuming cannabis before you get behind the wheel. But I'd like to think that it's a same thing as when you're consuming alcohol. The best place to be is at home, and then consume whatever your choice is, and stay there instead of being out on the roads.
You know, it's really interesting as well, as I've talked to police officers here in the city who say that a lot of people consume so much alcohol and then the next morning they think, oh, it's completely left my system, and they leave and go to work or they're out driving. It's still in their system, depending upon how much alcohol, and they're still considered impaired. I guess we have to consider that as well, even the next morning.
Definitely. It's one of those things that you always need to make sure that you've allowed your body enough time to process either the drugs or the alcohol and have your system clear before you do get behind the wheel.
Can you remind viewers about planning ahead and how important that is to prevent impaired driving?
Yes, it definitely is. So like we always say, plan ahead. So that means that you can either call a taxi, call Uber, call a friend that is sober or a family member, or if at all possible, you can stay where you are. But if you don't have a plan before you go out and then you start to consume alcohol or drugs, you may not be making those best decisions. And then that's when we find people are getting into trouble. So that's why we always really enforce the plan ahead.
Is Mothers Against Drunk Driving Canada in need of volunteers? And if so, how does someone get involved?
Always. We're always looking for volunteers, whether you want to give an hour, a day, a lifetime, we'll take it all. The easiest way, we've just rolled out here lately, is that you can go online to mad.ca and choose volunteering, and then you can pick the region that you are in and then fill out the volunteer form online, and that comes directly, if you're doing it for the Lethbridge area, that comes directly to me, and then I can be in touch with you and we can take it from there.
What about 2021? Let's talk about some of the special plans that you have set up with MAD.
You bet. I'm always an optimist, so I'm really hoping that 2021 is always on, kind of the even keel, and we're back out there doing our regular events and stuff. We had rolled out a crash car this summer, and we did it. It's kind of like a roving billboard, so it is a crash vehicle that was not involved in an impaired crash, and on the side of it says, "Please don't drink and drive." And we'll be rolling that back out this spring at a few locations throughout southern Alberta as a reminder to not drive impaired, as well as we're really hoping, we're kind of in the planning stages, but we're really hoping that we're going to be getting back out there with all the different communities that surround us at these small parades and different events and stuff, so that we can be chatting with people, get them the red ribbons that they so want for their vehicles and stuff, and just continue to keep everybody educated and have them think twice before they make that decision to get behind the wheel.
Anita, we always hear the tragic stories involving drunk drivers and their victims. Let's talk about success stories, or maybe a feel-good story with Mothers Against Drunk Driving, maybe a story that you can share with our viewers.
I guess I try to think of, there was one classroom that I was doing a discussion in. There was a young girl in that classroom who really wasn't paying attention to our presentation. It was like she couldn't wait for us to kind of get it done and over with. And then I started to share a little bit more statistics and show some people that were closer to her age. And the principal of the school made the comment that he noticed that this young girl sat up in school and started to really pay attention to the talk I was giving. And when I was done, she came over and thanked me for sharing. And that right there really kind of warmed my heart, because I was hoping that our message got through to her. She'll think twice about this. And right there, we may have just saved a life without knowing it.
That's beautiful. You never know whose heart you're really going to touch. Isn't that right, Anita?
That's 100%. 100%.
Anita HUCHALA is the president of the Lethbridge area chapter of MAD, or Mothers Against Drunk Driving. Anita, keep up the great work, and God bless you.
Thank you. Have a great evening.
On behalf of all of us here at Bridge City News, I'm Hal Roberts. God bless, and thanks for watching.